Hello everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar where we're going to explain the new EU Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So just a few a bit of technical information. So what you'll see on your screen is the PowerPoint, and you'll also see us. Hopefully you're sitting comfortably and you can hear and see us properly. Now what you can do is to decide to only look at the PowerPoint if you want, or else you could just look at us if you insist. But what we do recommend is that you try to follow the PowerPoint presentation because we think it'll be much clearer that way. Now also during the webinar it's possible for you to send us questions. So under the PowerPoint you've got a small text box and you can send us the questions or comments that you may have during the webinar. And what we'll do is we'll try to answer some of these questions, at least depending a bit on the number of questions we receive, at the end of our PowerPoint presentation, and that will last around 45 minutes. So I think we can start now. So the first slide is aimed to really set the scene, to explain to you where we stand on this adoption process of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. Now, in fact, it's not yet formally adopted. It's not yet published in the official journal. We're quite, well, it's basically, we have a political agreement, so the rules are there, but the Council and the Parliament still need to formally adopt the text. And that's expected to take place around about October time. Once that's done, then the text will be officially published in the official journal, and after 21 days, it basically enters into force. And then the member states will have 21 months to introduce into their national laws implementing laws. So basically, we're talking about summer of 2020, when all these rules will actually enter into force. So just a few words of caution here. Obviously, this webinar rather, is about the EU Audiovisual Media Services Directive in a nutshell. So we've decided to cover only certain topics, the topics that we believe are probably the most interesting or the most that bring about the most changes. So it's not a comprehensive overview of the directive. Now we will be we're setting up a new training program whereby Laura or we can come in and present to you all the rules of this new Audiovisual Media Services Directive, and you'll be receiving some information about that hopefully during the summer, so stay tuned. Also, of course, we're basing ourselves on an unofficial version of the text. The text isn't yet published in the official journal, so we're basing ourselves on a text that's widely available, but it's not the official version. But still, we believe that, of course, what we're going to tell you is actually the rules that will be in place. Okay, so also for those that don't stay to the bitter end, of course, you'll be able to watch this webcast in catch-up, and we'll be sending you a link so that you can see the whole thing if you have to go before the end of the seminar. So my next, if I can get it through yet, my next slide is basically to give you a little bit of an overview of the context of the adoption of the various revisions, if you want, of the directive. So already in 1989, you can see from the picture there, we were sitting in our little sitting rooms and we were all watching television on one single television set. And believe it or not, but already at that time we were receiving television broadcasts from lots of different member states, lots of different countries. And already at that time, so in 1989, the European institutions came up with the idea that there should be some form of harmonization of the rules applicable to these television broadcasts, so that we could all we could circulate these broadcasts freely throughout the EU. And for instance, there were already harmonised rules on the protection of minors, on how much advertising we could see, on what the content of advertising could be. And the directive, and it's still true today, was based on this famous country of origin principle, meaning that broadcasters only needed to comply with the legislation of the member state in which they were established, and on the basis of complying with that legislation, they could then circulate all that content freely throughout the EU. And the receiving member state, consequently, couldn't restrict incoming broadcast services coming from other member states. So that's the country of origin principle and the freedom of reception and retransmission principle. Now, also what's important to emphasise is that during the whole of the different phases of this directive, it's always been based on a minimum harmonisation approach, meaning that the member states are allowed to introduce more far-reaching provisions than those contained in the directive. What the directive does is to contain the minimum rules that have to be ensured by all the member states so that these television broadcasts can circulate freely. Now, if we just turn to the last big revision of this directive, that was in 2007, and the idea, as you can see here now from the picture, is that we were beginning, well, we were certainly really watching television on demand or through catch-up services. And the idea was there to extend the basic protection that was already governing television broadcasts to non-linear services. And there were lighter rules at that stage for non-linear service providers. Now, the last big revision, and this is the one we're talking about at the moment, is to do with the fact that more and more people are now consuming video on all sorts of platforms, including on video sharing platforms. And the idea is to extend the scope of the rules that apply to broadcast and to on-demand services to these video sharing platforms. Also, another big objective is to try to introduce a more level playing field between the rules that apply to television broadcast services and to non-linear service providers. So that's the thrust of this now big reform. Now, it's also, of course, motivated by the fact, I'm just going to give you one figure, that there's more than 4,000 hours of video that's uploaded every minute on video sharing platforms. So it's huge. So of course it's a direct competition towards watching television or on Netflix type services. So let me now turn to these new rules that apply to video sharing platforms. I think this is one of the most innovative parts of the directive, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the new rules. So, to give you a little bit of context, you probably all know, especially those that are following us from the EU, that it's the European Commission that proposes legislation, and then it needs to be adopted by what we call the co-legislators, which is the European Parliament and the Council. And the idea for the Commission initially was to only cover large video sharing platforms. And strangely enough, the European Commission, well, it wasn't strange really, I don't mean that in a funny way, but basically the European Commission had decided to propose a maximum harmonisation approach, meaning that the member states couldn't introduce different rules than the rules that were going to be proposed at the EU level. So basically we would have had the same level of protection in all the member states. Now, in fact, that didn't happen, and I'm going to turn to the definition of what is a video sharing platform in a minute. But the idea in the end of this maximum harmonisation wasn't achieved, and we are here again in an area of minimum harmonisation. So you always have to remember when Laura and I are explaining things that these are really the minimum rules, and of course member states could introduce more far-reaching rules. Now, a big consequence, especially for all the regulators that are here today, is that I'm afraid, or else you may be happy, but you will become, in a way, responsible to check the compliance of these new rules that apply to video sharing platforms. So they're going to become somehow under your sphere of responsibility. So I can hear a big sigh in the rooms here, but anyway, so don't forget that. Now, what is a video sharing platform? Well, you'll see from this definition that it's defined in a pretty wide manner, and I think it's fair to say that it's fairly neutral from a technological point of view. It's basically a service that's provided for remuneration. Now, that basically means either a paid service or a service that could be funded just by advertising, so a service provided for remuneration, or a dissociable section of the service. And the principal purpose or the essential functionality, that's going to be defined by the European Commission is going to issue guidelines on what an essential functionality is. And this is important, is to provide both, well, programs, user-generated videos, or both, with the objective to inform, entertain, and educate the general public by an electronic communications network. That's pretty simple. Now, it's important to say that the text acknowledges that these video sharing platforms have absolutely no editorial responsibility over all this content. But the video sharing platforms will be covered to the extent that they actually determine the organization of all this content. And the text actually also explains that this could be done by automatic means or by algorithms. So you don't necessarily have to have a person behind it to decide how all this content is going to be organized. So maybe we'll see a little bit later during the questions, but it could also potentially cover social media platforms like Facebook, where, of course, a lot of this content is uploaded by users. So we're going to turn now to, well, what is it exactly that they've got to do? The text talks about making sure that member states ensure that these video sharing platforms take appropriate measures. And I've put it in inverted commas because I'll explain a little bit more what these appropriate measures are. But to do what? Basically to do three things. First of all, to protect minors, then also to protect the general public, so me and you, and then there are also separate rules on advertising on these video sharing platforms. So let me just run through quickly what each of these elements means. So first of all, protect minors. So this, of course, we know that a lot of children actually do consume video content on these user-generated platforms, and of course it's a key issue to protect minors. So what does the directive say? Well, basically it says that video sharing platforms have got to take appropriate measures to protect minors from programs, user-generated video and advertising which could impair their physical, mental or moral development. They've also got to make sure that the most harmful content, which of course isn't defined and will have to be defined at national level, is to be subject to the strictest measures. The second category of person to protect is the general public, so you and me, including the children, of course. So the video sharing platforms have got to make sure that programs, user-generated video and advertising doesn't contain content which could be an incitement to violence or hatred on a number of grounds that are listed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. And you have the grounds that are listed there on the slide. I'm not going to go through them. They've also got to make sure that content, if it circulates, would constitute an activity which is a criminal offence under EU law. So that, of course, that type of content could not be made available on video sharing platforms. And we're talking here about a certain number of clearly defined criminal offences, like incitement to commit a terrorist offence, child pornography, or offences concerning racism and xenophobia. In relation to advertising, there's a distinction to be drawn between, on the one hand, the video sharing platform's own advertising, and on the other hand, advertising that's been uploaded by others. So, in relation to their own advertising that the video sharing platform decides to display, video sharing platforms have got to comply now with qualitative rules on advertising, and these are rules to do, for instance, with the type of products that cannot be advertised. And so basically they come into a level playing field with television broadcasters or on-demand service providers. In relation to the advertising that could be uploaded by users or by others, the requirement isn't as strong, but they've got to take what they call, again, appropriate measures to ensure that others actually do comply with these qualitative rules. So it's not them directly that need to comply, they've got to make sure that others do. Okay? And then the other element is that these video sharing platforms have got to inform viewers of the fact that there is advertising on the platform, either their own advertising or the advertising of others, to the extent that they have knowledge of this advertising. It's important to say also that co- and self-regulation is very much encouraged to reduce the exposure of children to junk food. Now, of course, I can hear everybody saying, well, what are these appropriate measures? So, I mean, the directive gives a few elements for us to understand a little bit more what's behind this notion. The directive says that these appropriate measures will really depend on the type of content, the potential harm, and the type of people that you need to protect. Importantly, you know, if you remember, I said at the beginning the Commission had only wanted to cover the large video sharing platforms. Well, basically, as you see from the definition, all video sharing platforms are potentially covered. However, in these elements to explain to us what these appropriate measures are, the the directive actually says that the measures should be practicable and proportionate to the size and nature of the video sharing platforms. So presumably the bigger video sharing platforms should introduce maybe a different set of measures compared to the smaller video sharing platform. Now, and contrary to other initiatives that are going through the adoption process now in the European institutions, it's very clearly said that these measures cannot constitute an ex-ante control mechanism, and they can't be upload filters. So it's not something that's got to, the content hasn't got to be screened and filtered before it's uploaded. So the measures have got to be there to ensure that once, in a way, that either they're not put up by the users or that they are removed quickly. And the directive also says that it can't be, the measures must comply with the non-monitoring obligation of the e-commerce directive. So, sorry, I've gone too quickly now. I'll just move back. So, the directive contains a list of appropriate measures, and initially, of course, these measures were, when the Commission initially proposed the directive, these were the only measures that could be introduced. Now, of course, we need to read it in a different way, because it's a list of appropriate measures, and Member States would probably be able to introduce more types of measures, possibly. So they're all listed here, but basically to explain to you, there are some that relate to the terms and conditions of the video sharing platforms. And that's the idea that the terms and conditions of video sharing platforms should clearly define what's allowed and what's not allowed in relation to content that could be harmful to minors, harmful to the general public, or in relation to advertising. So inform, basically, people. There's got to be a functionality to allow uploaders to declare if the content contains advertising, because you know that there's also an obligation for the video sharing platforms to inform viewers that the content contains advertising. So they need to know somehow. So this is this functionality. They've got to operate transparent and user-friendly reporting and flagging mechanisms so that people can report content that's potentially damageable. And they've also got to explain what follow-up is given to this reporting and flagging that's been going on. In relation to the protection of minors, they've got to put in place age verification systems of minors and also easy-to-use rating systems for content. Or parental control systems under the control of users should also be deployed. And then they've got to operate a dispute resolution procedure in case of dispute between the platform and the users. So I mean, there's quite a lot of requirements, but as you see, they're more of a sort of an operational in nature. So I'm going to turn now to something completely different and to the role of regulators. So we've already mentioned that regulators will again be having more competence, more power over these video sharing platforms. But maybe more fundamentally, in a way, it's the first time in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive that there is a very clear mention of an obligation to designate regulatory authorities. And there are also very strong requirements now in relation to the fact that these authorities need to be independent both from the government and from the operators. So I'm not going to go through all the elements that are listed on this slide, but basically there are quite a few requirements to do with independence and efficient functioning. And this also means now that the European Commission will have some sort of an oversight over the regulatory setup of media regulatory authorities.
Sorry, Michelle, if I interrupt you, just to say, because you said you're not going to go through the slide, just to say that we received a question. I cannot answer I cannot answer because I don't know exactly how this works.
Yeah.
But they're asking if the slides will be available afterwards.
Yes.
The slides will be available afterwards.
Yes.
So even if we don't go through all the text, you'll have the slides.
Exactly. Yes. So please don't worry. And of course you can send us questions, and everything will be available to you as well after the webinar. Thank you, Laura. So I'm not going to explain all these rules because I think it's a bit too technical, but it is a very important new element in the directive. Now, the other element is the fact that now in the directive, the ERGA, which is the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, is enshrined, if you want. And basically, this group of regulators is composed of all the national regulators, and with the European Commission is also a member of ERGA. Now, the role of ERGA is to provide technical expertise to the European Commission, but also it's a forum for exchange of experience and best practice among regulators. And the role of ERGA is increased in certain areas to do with the country of origin principle and the derogations to this principle, and for instance also on accessibility. So this ERGA already existed, but it was set up under a Commission decision in 2014. But now it's really its place is really enshrined in the European text. So I think that's also an innovation. Something that's going to ease also the cooperation between the member states is the fact that now member states are going to establish and maintain an up-to-date list of all the providers under their jurisdiction, so therefore that they regulate, and inform the Commission of this list. The Commission then will establish a big database, well, a database, yes, because there's lots of operators that are established in the EU, and make sure that all the regulators have access to this database, and also that the public has access to the database. And this is also aimed to make sure that there aren't any inconsistencies about who has jurisdiction over an operator, so a broadcaster, an on-demand provider, or a video sharing platform as defined. A word about co- and self-regulation. So from the text we can see that co- and self-regulation, the role of co- and self-regulation is increased, and is particularly true in certain areas, such as video sharing platforms or advertising. There's also the mention of EU codes of conduct that could be established. And of course, co- and self-regulation is not a means of implementing the directive, but the European Commission and the directive actually does foster co- and self-regulation, because it's a very good way to make sure that the rules are actually endorsed and applied in practice by the operators. I'm going to move on now to the country of origin principle and the derogation for audiovisual media service providers. So you remember that I talked about the core principle of this country of origin principle and freedom to provide. And basically, this core principle very much remains under this new directive, but it's slightly adapted. And I'm going to focus in my next slide on what you've probably all heard about, which is the Netflix tax. And it's not correctly called like that because it doesn't only cover Netflix, of course, but it basically allows member states to impose financial contributions on non-national providers, whereas normally under the country of origin principle, if you listen to me correctly, you would understand that normally that would not be possible. So the other two areas where there's been a few adaptations, and I'm not going to move into this area because it's hugely technical and lots of procedural rules that I think would not be appropriate for me to talk about here. It's to do with the provisional derogations. So it's to do with when a member state is allowed to block a given service from another member state on certain important grounds. And I'm just going to say here that the grounds now have been aligned both for linear and non-linear services. The other area where there's been change is to do with the circumvention procedure, and this is a slightly different procedure under Article 4 of the directive, and it enables basically a member state to apply its own rules to service providers that are established in another member state to the extent that they've established themselves in that member state to precisely avoid the application of more strict rules in the country of reception. So again here, the rules have been, I went too quickly, have been aligned for linear and non-linear services. Now, I'm going to talk now about this derogation to the country of origin principle in the form of what we call the press has been calling the Netflix tax. So basically, it allows member states that already require financial contributions from national providers to also impose these contributions on non-national providers. And non-national providers, I mean both Netflix-type services and television channels. I'm not talking about video sharing platforms here. that target their national audience. And there are a few elements in the directive to explain what this targeting means. So it's, for instance, the fact that you cover your content is available in the language of the country of reception. So basically, it's possible for them to require financial contributions from these non-national providers, but only based on the revenues that are earned in the targeted member states. And it's these financial contributions have also got to take into account the payments that were made in the country of origin or country of establishment. To the positive, these non-national providers should also be able to benefit from film funding aid in the country of reception, even if they don't have an establishment in that country. Now, here is an area where the Commission will publish guidance because Member States will be obliged to introduce exceptions for low turnover and low audience providers. And also, here it's an option. Member States will be allowed to waive certain obligations if it's impracticable or unjustified in certain circumstances.
So we'll now go through, maybe before that, just some information, because we are receiving quite a lot of questions. So we'll cover your questions at the end. If we don't cover them through the presentations, because some of them will be covered through the presentation. The ones that we are not going to cover today will answer in writing. Okay. So in this second section of the presentation, we are going to have a look at how current rules that apply to audiovisual media services are revised in the new directive. The first thing that you should know is that the scope of the current directive for what concerns audiovisual media services is substantially unchanged. The new directive still regulates services that can be either linear television services or on-demand services, independently from the transmission technology they are distributed with, and if they comply with these three criteria. First of all, they must be provided against remuneration, so against a payment, under the editorial responsibility of a provider who has an effective control over the selection of content and the organization of the programs in either the on-demand catalog or the schedule, if we are talking about a television channel. And then their principal purpose must be to provide programs with the objective to inform, entertain, or educate the general public. Okay? However, in the new directive, there are two quite important clarifications. The first one is that an audiovisual media service can also be a dissociable section of a service that is not an audiovisual media service. And the second one is that to fall within the definition, the audiovisual media service doesn't need to provide television-like programs. So what does this mean in practice? It means that, for instance, a video standalone section of an online newspaper or a YouTube channel are on-demand audiovisual media services if they comply with the three criteria. So they are provided against remuneration, under the editorial responsibility of a provider, and their principal purpose is to provide programs that can also be short video clips to entertain, educate, or inform the general public. Now, if we take a YouTube channel that complies with the three criteria, now it will be, of course, up to the provider who exercises the editorial responsibility to comply with the rules that apply to on-demand services, while YouTube needs only to comply with the new rules that are now applicable to video sharing platforms. Why is this relevant? Why the category, the regulatory category where a service falls matters? Well, because the treatment is significantly different. There is no level playing field between these three categories of services. So the new directive is not relaxing the rules that currently apply to audiovisual media services. On the opposite, it is strengthening some of the rules, including by regulating new aspects that are not considered in the current directive. So the level of protection for audiovisual media services remains significantly higher compared to video sharing platforms. And then among the different audiovisual media services, the directive significantly increases the burdens on on-demand services, but it doesn't achieve a full level playing field with linear services, which remain bound by additional rules on advertising, additional rules on the promotion of European production, and stricter rules on the promotion of European production. So now, of course, I'm not going to have the time to go through all the new rules in the directive because we have only, I think, 15 minutes to go. But I'm going to give you a few examples, and then, of course, you can ask us questions. The first example regards a rule that has been strengthened in the new directive and that applies to all audiovisual media services. So the European Commission wanted and proposed to delete the rules on accessibility in this directive to include them in an horizontal Accessibility Act that is currently under discussion. Now, both Parliament and the Council disagree with this proposal, wanted to have them back, to have rules back in this directive, and agreed in strengthening them. So rather than an encouragement for all audiovisual media services providers to gradually make their services accessible with persons with visual or hearing disability, the new directive contains a requirement, again for all audiovisual media services providers, to make their services continuously and progressively more accessible for people with all kinds of disabilities without undue delay. So quite a stronger wording. However, the new directive does not set a specific target or deadline, and it leaves it to member states to decide which measures to apply, provided these measures are proportionate. The new directive also adds a few things. So the first thing is an encouragement for providers to notify action plans and communicate them, to develop action plans and to communicate them to their regulatory authorities. And then it requires them to make accessible those emergency information that are made available through audiovisual media services, like, for instance, public announcements in a situation of natural disaster. And then it requires providers to report on the implementation of these provisions to their national regulatory authorities. Now, I said that the new directive also covers new aspects that are not considered in the current directive, and one of these is media literacy. Now, this new Article 33A does not set a direct obligation on providers to promote media literacy. This obligation is actually mentioned in one of the non-binding recitals that introduce the substantive articles, so at the beginning of the directive, but again non-binding. However, the directive requires member states to take measures for the development of media literacy skills, which could, of course, also target audiovisual media services. Another, I think, quite interesting rule was a rule that was actually demanded by audiovisual media services provider to safeguard the integrity of their services against interferences by third parties, so for instance a connected TV manufacturer or by distributors. The rule says that the provider's explicit consent is required to overlay its service for commercial purposes or to modify it. And it also says that member states, when setting the measures in their national legislation, they must specify the regulatory details, including exceptions to safeguard users. And here again, there is a non-binding recital that helps us understanding this rule, because it says that member states are not allowed to impose an explicit consent in the case the overlay is solely initiated or authorized by the user for private use. So, for instance, if the overlay results from an individual communication service. Now, if we turn to those rules that remain only applicable to linear television services, I think the main novelty is that the advertising time limit is more flexible. Now, you can see the rule under the first bullet point. I think the important point to highlight here is that the total amount of advertising and teleshopping spots that a broadcaster can broadcast during the day remains the same. But the broadcasters have now the flexibility, so the freedom to decide how to place, so to distribute half of this total amount from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and the other half of this total amount from 6 p.m. to midnight. And this is quite important. Now, the new directive also clarifies that broadcasters, when calculating this time limit, can exclude those spots that aim to promote their sister channels or sister on-demand services that belong to the same broadcast group. And they can also exclude those black frames of a few seconds that are inserted in between two ads or between an ad and a program for some technical reasons. Okay? Now, those exclusions go on the top of what is already excluded in the current directive, that is to say, self-promotion, sponsorship announcements, of course, product placement, and then what is not considered to be advertising. So, for instance, charity appeals that are broadcast free of charge, because there is no remuneration. Okay? Then, for what concerns the restrictions that broadcasters need to follow regarding the insertion of advertising spots in certain programs, like for instance news or films, or the restrictions on the insertion of isolated spots in any type of program, those restrictions remain unchanged. But there is a new prohibition in the new directive to place teleshopping spots in children programs. Now let's turn to protection of minors, because this is one of the two examples where rules have been leveled up for on-demand service to achieve a complete level playing field with linear services. So from now on, the same rules will apply to all audiovisual media services providers. Now, sorry, I went too far. I summarized the rules in mainly 4 points. So what has changed regarding rules on protection of minors? The first thing is that the new directive replaces the prohibition for linear television to broadcast the most harmful content, for instance pornography, with a requirement to apply the strictest measures that will be for member states to define, and extends this provision also to on-demand services. It also extends to on-demand services the obligation to apply measures such as watersheds or age verification tools to ensure that minors don't see the content that could be potentially harmful to them, And this type of content could now be freely offered by on-demand services because according to the current directive, they were only required to protect minors against seriously harmful content, like pornography or gratuitous violence. Now, the directive also extends to on-demand services the obligation to provide sufficient information to viewers. And now this information should describe the harmful nature of the content. And this is new for all services providers. And then, last but not least, one novelty for all audiovisual media services provider is a prohibition to process for commercial purposes minors' personal data that are collected by providers by the application of these measures. The second example where rules have been leveled up for on-demand services, and again here there is a full level playing field between linear and non-linear services, are rules on alcohol advertising. So the new directive extends to advertising spots that are placed in on-demand services those qualitative prohibitions that were currently only applying to advertising spots placed in linear television services. So we are talking about for instance, the prohibition to link the consumption of alcohol to driving, or to link drinking alcohol with an enhanced physical performance or social success, and so on. Now, on the top of this, there is also a novelty for all audiovisual media services providers, that is a new encouragement to use codes of conduct that must aim to effectively reduce the exposure of minors to commercial communications, so including sponsorship and product placement for alcoholic beverages. And this encouragement goes on the top of the general prohibition that remains in place for all providers and all commercial communications for alcoholic beverages to specifically target minors. Finally, I wanted to show you one last example regarding rules on the promotion of European productions. And in this case, again, rules have been strengthened for on-demand services, but not to the level of current restrictions, the obligations that apply at the moment to linear television services. So here there is no level playing field. The new requirement for on-demand services is to dedicate 30% of their catalogs to European works and to ensure their prominence. And there is a non-binding recital that provides a few examples on how to provide prominence to a work. And then the directive says that member states need to exempt those on-demand services that have a low turnover or a low audience, and can decide, if they want to also exempt services if, due to their nature or their theme, the obligations are impracticable or unjustified. Okay? Now, the Commission needs to issue guidelines both on the calculation of the new 30% quota and also on the exemption for low turnover or low audience services. And finally, as I said, the rules on the promotion of European works remain unchanged for linear television services, apart from the so-called Netflix tax that Michel talked about earlier. And linear television services, therefore, have a stricter quota obligations. They have a 50% threshold. And on the top of that, they have additional obligations regarding the promotion of independent European works. And those remain in place. So these were the examples I wanted to cover. Now we'll see if you ask more questions on other new rules.
Yes, so let's look at some of the questions we've received, Laura. Do you want to start, or shall I start?
I have a question for you that I think I received at the beginning, so I think we should try to answer that one. And it is to clarify ERGA vis-à-vis the contact committee and NEPRA.
Aha. Yeah, I mean, ERGA has got nothing to do with EPRA. So EPRA is the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities that's got a much wider attendance than the ERGA, which only groups the regulatory authorities from EU 28. And ERGA has got a clear role in relation to advising the European Commission. EPRA has got a wider, well, it's got a wider scope in a sense, and so they've got nothing to do with each other, and both groups, as I understand it, will continue to coexist in happy harmony. In relation to the contact committee, again, I think that's a different. Again, a different committee, which is composed not necessarily of regulatory authorities, but also of ministries, and its role is much closer to the European Commission. And so I think that each of these authorities have a distinct, but probably. Sometimes it's not overlapping, but similar roles as well. But I don't see that there's particular conflict of competence between these authorities. So maybe I was looking at one that I received. Somebody was asking us about the rules on product placement.
Yes.
So we've not covered these rules, Laura, but basically the person's asking how, to what extent these rules have changed with the adoption of this new directive, and if we think that potentially broadcasters could receive more revenues from product placement than currently. So do you have a?
Yes,
can you perhaps give us a bit of detail about that?
Well, very briefly, the European Commission had proposed to drop the prohibition to give undue prominence to the product in product placement, and that was exactly to unlock some additional revenues for providers. Now, both Parliament and the Council were against this proposal, so they rejected it. So the undue prominence prohibition is still there.
So you're not allowed to give undue prominence to the product that you're
yes, and again. How to define undue prominence is something that member states should do to provide some more legal clarity. Now, there are changes. The main change in the new rules is that there is more legal clarity because product placement is clearly allowed, except for certain programs. For instance, news and current affairs, children programs, religious programs, or consumer affairs programs, while at the moment in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, product placement is prohibited.
Yes, that's right, so it's reversing.
Except for a positive list of programs. So that makes the difference. And then there are there is a very small clarification on the rules on the editorial influence with on-demand services, but it's really a clarification of existing rules. Nothing will change in practice, I think. I mean, the providers will not have more opportunities for product placement, and of course that will depend also on how the different member states will transpose the rules, because last time many member states transposed the rules in a stricter way.
Yeah, and then we do have data on this type of thing at Cullen as well. We have benchmarks where we track these important questions at national level, because I'm sure you've all understood that it's at national level that things really do vary tremendously between member states.
And I think we also sent you, because I had a couple of questions on rules on the promotion of EU work. So we sent you 2 tables.
Yeah, I don't know if you've received it, but you will be receiving this material after the webinar if you haven't had it yet.
Can I ask you, Michelle, a question that I received on video sharing platforms?
Yes.
The fact that YouTube is a non-European video sharing platform, because you haven't covered this point in your presentation.
No, it's true. I mean, all these rules in the AVMS Directive apply to the extent that there is EU jurisdiction, so that somehow the operators concerned are established in the EU. Now, there are very detailed rules in relation to how to establish jurisdiction in relation to television channels and on-demand service providers. But also the directive contains a specific article which is separate from all the other articles on jurisdiction, which is just the one after the regulation of video sharing platforms, Article 28B for the nerds. And basically, the directive is trying to capture as many video sharing platforms as possible, including those that are not established in the EU directly. So the idea is that so long as a video sharing platform has either a subsidiary or a parent company located in the EU, it's established in the EU, then that video sharing platform will be covered. And the other way to make sure that these players are covered is because if they're part of a group, and if any undertaking which is part of that same group is established in the EU, then the video sharing platform will be covered. So it was clear that the intention behind all this was to capture as many non-national, non-EU players as possible. So we'll have to see how this functions in practice. But that was clearly the intention, at least.
Thank you. On behalf of who sent you this question?
I don't know. You received that question. So let me just see. I think I had one more question that I thought was quite interesting, and that was to do with the scope of these new rules. It's the person asking, what about television platforms, cable operators, satellite operators? To what extent are these platforms covered by if I can understand the question correctly, I think that's what it means. To what extent are these platforms, so I suppose closed platforms, are they covered by these new rules? Is there any? Okay,
I think the first thing we should say is that if, for instance, a pay TV platforms provide its own on-demand services or television channels, of course these services are included in the scope of rules for audiovisual media services, so either for on-demand services or for linear television
because
services.
They have editorial responsibility. Yes.
Then, if we are talking about their activity as distributors, so they distribute, they provide, offer to viewers packages of channels and on-demand services that they provide to users, but on which they don't have editorial responsibility, then also in this directive they remain excluded from the scope of rules that apply to audiovisual media services, because in this case they will not have editorial responsibility on the services. They put them into packages, but they don't have, and they have some roles to play in the organization of the packages that they provide to the viewers, but not on the organization of the programs themselves within the on-demand catalog or the television channel.
Yes, that's correct, and also we have a table on that which actually shows that some member states have gone further and actually do have a separate category of distributor of linear services or non-linear services, and they regulate them separately in a different way, but at EU level, so the rules don't change. Laura, is that what we're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. You could argue, because there is also the definition of video sharing platforms, that says that a platform falls within the definition, even if it doesn't have to provide user-generated videos to be a video sharing platform. It could also only provide programs. And there is not the criteria of editorial responsibility. But again, what a traditional television platform does is not to provide the programs, so the content, or to organize the content within its service. It provides services
That's right,
that are already
of different nature. So
yes,
So for me it's clear. I hope it's clear for everybody else. So do we have, shall I just quickly look and see, what's the time? It's probably time to finish now, I think.
So.
It's 5 past, so we're bang on time, I think, because we started 5 minutes late. So Laura and I wanted to thank you very much for attending this webinar. You can watch it again and again and again if you'd like to. You'll be receiving a link from my colleague Sarah. Also, you'll have access to the reading list. And I think we also want to say that we'll keep you posted, because we'll probably be organising other webinars in other areas covered by Cullen International, so telecom, postal, competition law, and digital economy. And so keep tuned for more webinars. Also send us your comments following this webinar. That will help us to improve our performance. And so it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me too.
And goodbye from Cullen International. Goodbye.